excellent connection. Pop you out. Open Kindle. Alright, tell me what happened.
Um, Jillian is like, I'm gonna find out how to get my own money. Don't follow me. Or money on my own. And then so he leaves and he goes to this secluded little forest trail and he hides and he's gonna rob people, but every time someone walks by, he's like, "No, I can't possibly rob them. They look like they need it." And he eventually waits for hours and then he tries to steal from fucking this fucking guy and he fails, so the guy screams and runs, so he follows him and the guy falls and he was praying to gods to help him. And so a bunch of heavenly officials are standing there
Mm-hmm.
staring at him and he's staring back like, uh-oh. Um and they figured out who he was and so they said, "Don't worry, we won't tell anyone."
Yeah.
That's funny though. And Chilian went home because he was like so embarrassed. What the fuck? I just zoomed in on my Discord. Wesker, why'd you do that? Um
So we
he
can see.
it's the tablet thing.
Yeah, yeah.
Um and so he goes back home because he feels like awful about the whole thing. He's like, I should have never done that. And Function is like, it's okay. I'm gonna go out and busk now, though. You can just stay here. It's fine. And
He didn't tell Function what he
he's
did, though.
right. He didn't tell him. And he sits at home and he just can't take it because there's too much going on and he needs to be alone because he's having a panic attack. Um, so he wanders to the graveyard and he's like, he steals a offering of liquor, and so he drinks a whole jug.
Mm-hmm.
And he starts getting drunk, and Ghostfire is around him, and he thinks it's talking to him, but he doesn't know because he's drunk. And then he he falls into an open grave
Yeah.
and starts cussing up a storm.
Yeah.
And he's trying to get out, and he can't get out, and the Ghostfire is trying to help. It looks like, and he thinks it's just the guy that's like, get out of here, that he stole the liquor from.
Mm-hmm.
And does he finally get out? Yeah, he finally gets out, and he's super cold because it's really cold out, and the ghost fire is trying to warm him, but it's ghost fire, so it's only cold.
Yeah.
And this guy goes through so much.
Yeah, that's basically
The
where we left
worst
off.
evening.
Yeah. So that ends with God, is it calling for me? Shilian wondered to himself. But even if it was praying to him, it would be pointless. He was already powerless as a god, and he was even less capable now that he wasn't. Your Highness? Your Highness? Your Highness! It was Function's shoving that woke Shilian up. Shilian blinked his eyes open laboriously and found himself lying in a narrow alleyway. Function's face was hanging above him. He let out a breath of relief when he noticed Shilian was awake, but a moment later his relief was replaced with traces of anger. Your Highness, what's going on with you? Running off on your own for 2 days without a word? If you don't come back soon, I won't be able to keep hiding it from their majesties. Chilean slowly sat up. 2 days? When he spoke, he found that his throat was dry and his voice hoarse. His temples throbbed, and his head ached like it was going to split. He sort of remembered what had happened, but not really. Function crouched by his side. That's right! 2 days! Where exactly did you go? Why are you running around like a madman? Had he been drunk for 2 days? Why wasn't he in some wild graveyard? Why was he laying here? Function's tone made Julian shiver with foreboding. What did I do? You were possessed, Function said gruffly. Smashing stalls all over the place, beating people up. You even tried to confront some patrolling Yong'an soldiers, and I don't know what else you did before that. When Chilean heard he'd even gone after Yong'an soldiers, he was shocked. I confronted the soldiers? Then what happened to them? Luckily, I found you and stopped you, Function replied. And since you look like this, they assumed you were just some crazy drunkard. They yelled at you but didn't bother doing anything else. Otherwise, you'd be dead for sure. What happened to you? Why does it look like you were drinking? Chilean looked down at himself and found that he was filthy, covered from head to toe with mud and grime. He scratched his head, and his hair was as messy as that of a criminal being dragged to his execution. He certainly did resemble a crazy drunkard who had slept on the streets all day. Chilean was briefly silent before he crawled to his feet and replied vaguely, Yeah, I drank a bit. Function couldn't wrap his head around this. Huh? How could you drink? And how much did you drink to be drunk for 2 days? Seeing Function's look of disbelief irritated Chilean for no good reason, and he walked on ahead. I already said I didn't drink that much, just a bit. No big deal. Why can't I drink? Function hadn't expected him to answer like this, and was stunned for a moment, then chased after him. What do you mean, no big deal? Has your Highness forgotten? Drinking breaks the precepts. You can't break them. Otherwise, how can you cultivate? You have to ascend again. Chilean quickened his pace, the moment he heard cultivate and ascend. He didn't want to listen any more. Your Highness! Function called out. He caught up again, and after a moment's hesitation he tried, Did something happen? Why won't you tell me? Hearing Function question him so cautiously, Chilean opened and closed his mouth, wanting to speak, but unable to. He might break down if he didn't tell someone soon, but he also wasn't sure how Function would react if he told him. He didn't dare make that gamble. Seeing him distracted, Function added, Honestly, it's not like you killed or robbed someone, so what is it that your Highness can't tell me? It's not like you killed or robbed someone. Those words threatened to suffocate him. Before, he might have wavered on the matter. He might have tried to tell the truth and trust his luck. But all such hopes were thoroughly shattered in that moment. Chilean tipped his head and turned to keep walking. It's nothing. It's just, I'm really tired. He replied hazily. He was just about to make up an excuse when he noticed something on Function's cheek and stopped in his tracks. What happened to your face? Function felt his cheek, and his muscles tensed when he seemed to prod somewhere that hurt. There was a gash on his face, and one of his arms had been wrapped carefully with the neatly layered bandages. Someone else had clearly taken care of them for him, but Chilean was primarily concerned about the injuries underneath the dressings. How did you get hurt? No mortal could easily harm someone with Function's skill, and it was his shooting arm that had been injured, no less. But Function didn't seem to care. Oh, it's nothing. Just some thugs trying to wreck my business, that's all. Chilean was shocked and bewildered. Was it the street performers from the other day? Yeah, them, Function replied. Why did they crash your show? Chilean questioned. But then he understood. Was it because you still went to busk after we admitted defeat that day, so they came to chase you out? That was pretty much the whole story. A sudden rage exploded in Chilean's chest. Don't go there any more! Chilean's voice was hard. However, Function brushed him off. Who cares about them? I'll perform there whether they like it or not. You're the one who admitted defeat, not me, so it doesn't count as going back on my word. I'm going to set up shop there and busk no matter what happens. Other than sneaking around and crashing the show, what can they do to me? I wasn't prepared this time, but next time I will be. If it comes to fist fights, I'm not scared of them. The abrupt hostility that had rushed to Shulian's head instantly dissipated as he listened, replaced by guilt. Function had been steadfast, while Shulian was out wallowing in his own misery. How could he possibly face his loyal servant, this man who still hadn't abandoned him despite everything? Shulian sighed. I'm sorry, Function. Function was taken aback, then waved hard. Why is your highness apologizing to me? What rubbish? You were out earning money all by yourself for the past couple days. I'm sorry for the trouble, Shulian said. As long as you focus on your cultivation and ascend again, it'll be worth it, Function replied. There was the word ascend again. Shulian nodded heavily. The king and queen believed Function's lies and thought Shulian had spent the past few days training. When they saw him return, the queen happily cooked a meal as always. Shulian didn't have the heart to make Function suffer, so he took his bowl and helped him eat the food. He didn't sleep that night. The next day, Function rose bright and early and headed out, while Shulian remained behind to cultivate. Although he'd pulled himself together at that point and regathered his energy by a millionfold, he still couldn't focus. The only way to rise above the rest was to study and train diligently. That was just common sense. But was there even one in a million who had the ability to study and train for the extremely high level required? By the same logic, Shulian could tell himself to clear his mind 1,000,000 times, but it wasn't so easily achieved by just saying it. His cultivation progress remained at a standstill for a dozen consecutive days. Shulian wasn't accomplishing anything, and he couldn't help feeling anxious, especially since every night Function dragged his exhausted body back home, and he and the queen asked after Shulian's progress. The pressure he felt was indescribably immense. He didn't dare tell them the truth, so he could only vaguely answer that, yes, he was making progress, which made Function and the queen both very happy. Still, he knew this couldn't last forever. After 2 months, Shulian finally couldn't let it go on any longer. One evening, Function had returned very late, and he and Shulian sat at the table together, eating the previous day's leftovers. As they ate, Shulian suddenly turned to him. I'm afraid I'll have to leave for a while. Function was taken aback, but he didn't stop stuffing his face with rice. Huh? Leave? Where are you going? I'm going to search for quiet land filled with spiritual energy where I can cultivate in seclusion, Shulian said slowly. A cultivation spot with abundant spiritual energy gave the cultivator significant benefits. At first, Shulian hadn't wanted to leave his parents and attendants behind, so he'd never left them to pursue seclusion, but now he'd changed his mind. Function didn't overthink it. Great! Your Highness, you should have done this a long time ago. Cultivation is the most effective in quiet seclusion, after all. Shulian nodded, paused, and then said, I'll have to trouble you to look after father and mother while I'm gone. Function was about to respond, but he hesitated. Although it was only for a moment, Shulian knew him very well. How could he miss that flash of uncertainty? If you must go, then go, the king bellowed from the back room. This king doesn't need anyone to look after him. Function and Shulian lowered their bowls and chopsticks and looked towards the back room. It seemed the king wasn't asleep yet and had overheard their exchange, then barged in on their conversation. Shulian shook his head and whispered, Acting tough again. Function smiled. Don't worry, Your Highness. Of course I'll look after them. Well, that answer was completely straightforward. Still, Shulian didn't forget how Function had seemed to hesitate for a moment before answering, like he had some other conflicting concern. But when he thought about it, perhaps he was mistaken. Function didn't know anyone outside their group, and had no other attachments, so what other concerns could he have? Shulian stopped dwelling on it, and moved on to planning what needed to be done before his departure. The next day, Shulian packed a simple satchel and bid a temporary farewell to his parents and Function. He walked on foot for dozens of kilometers, eating and sleeping in the wild for days. Finally, he found a place suitable for quiet cultivation, with a thick, vast, remote mountain forest. Upon examining the area, Shulian was stunned at first, but soon his heart was filled with wild joy. Such luck! The feng shui here is excellent. I can't believe I found a rare piece of blessed land. Shulian could hardly believe it. His luck had turned around so unexpectedly after so much misfortune. He checked and rechecked until he was absolutely sure This area was indeed a sacred land brimming with spiritual energy. If he could immerse himself in training and focus on cultivation for the next few months, then surely he could achieve twice the result with half the effort. He could make exponential progress. Shilian finally saw a ray of hope, and his gloomy feelings from recent days suddenly cleared. His heart leapt with joy. "Father, Mother, Function, wait for me. I'll be back very soon." He hiked the steep, perilous mountain path for many hours, and finally entered the deepest recess of the spiritual mountain just before sunset. As he moved through the dense forest, he could clearly sense that he was getting closer and closer to the source of the land's spiritual energy. His steps grew quicker and lighter. But just as he was picking out a location for secluded cultivation, he was interrupted by the clamor of footsteps behind him. How could there be so many feet on such a secluded mountain? Shilian glanced over, but he couldn't have expected the sight that awaited him, and the smile on his face froze. A number of people had arrived behind him, about 30 in total. They came in various shapes and sizes, and all wore different styles of attire. But the one thing they had in common was that they were all heavenly officials. A few were officials of the lowest rank in the upper court, but most were officials from the lower court. And among them were the junior officials that had stumbled upon Shilian's failed robbery. When they saw Shilian, their faces subtly changed. They tugged at and elbowed each other, whispering amongst themselves under their breath. And when Shilian saw them, his hands immediately started trembling. Both parties stared at each other in dismay. It was some time before one of the heavenly officials cleared his throat. "What a coincidence that we'd run into your Royal Highness here." "Indeed, why is your Royal Highness come here as well?" Shilian gave a light nod, forcing himself to be calm and composed. He responded with neither haughtiness nor humility. "I'm here to train." Even though he was a different person now, Shilian still tried his best to speak with the same tone of voice he'd used before he was banished, refusing to allow himself to sound anxious or agitated. The heavenly official smiled. "An even greater coincidence. We've come to train too." Yeah, who knew that we'd run into each other here?" As it turned out, Shilian wasn't the only one who had spotted this blessed land. This group of heavenly officials had targeted it, too. Faced with this situation, Shilian hesitated. Would he have to cultivate alongside all these heavenly officials? Honestly, he despised the idea. He had come here to close himself off from the world and cultivate quietly. There'd no doubt be disturbances. He couldn't achieve solitude around this many people. Some people liked to cultivate in groups so they could take care of one another, but Shilian had always cultivated quietly on his own. Furthermore, ever since the robbery incident, he became anxious whenever he saw heavenly officials he'd once known. Other people's eyes felt as piercing as needles, and the stares tormented him. He was perpetually gripped by the delusional feeling that they were all secretly watching and judging him. He wouldn't be able to focus on cultivation in such a state. When it came to laying claim to blessed lands, there was a first-come, first-served rule. If Shilian was strong enough, he could simply state that he was here first, and request they find somewhere else to train. However, the junior officials who had witnessed the robbery incident were right there, so he couldn't act too forcefully. Besides, it'd seem overbearing if he chased away so many heavenly officials to keep this blessed land all to himself. Even if Shilian didn't want to train with other heavenly officials nearby, he had no choice. He would never be able to find another cultivation place with such plentiful spiritual energy, at least not quickly. Shilian could only nod. "Yeah, what a coincidence. I'll head in first. Please do as you will, everyone." He began to hurry off to find the quietest cave to hide. Yet a heavenly official behind him spoke up as he turned to go. "Hold on." Shilian paused and turned his head back, puzzled. "What is it?" Some of the 30 or so heavenly officials exchanged looks, and some exchanged whispers. A moment later, one stepped forward with a smile. "Your Highness took over many blessed lands in the past. Why don't you let us have this one?" Shilian was stunned for a long while before he understood. They were going to force him to leave entirely. How baffling! What bullies! A rush of blood ran to his head. "I was here first, but I didn't ask you to go," Shilian thought angrily. "Why are you all ganging up and trying to force me to leave?" But he didn't dare act out. After a moment of silence, He slowly gripped the strap of his satchel tighter. "What do you mean by this?" Shulian demanded, his voice hard. One of the heavenly officials began to explain. "Well, didn't we just say? Your Highness has claimed many blessed lands in the past." Shulian cut him off. "What does then have to do with now? Are you saying that since I've trained in spiritual lands before, I'm barred from doing it going forward?" The heavenly official was stumped into silence, looking embarrassed. Shulian tried to remain calm. "Also, I don't quite understand. It's not like the rest of you can't cultivate because I'm here. Isn't it just common to share a spiritual land when cultivating? Why can't we all just keep to ourselves? Why must you ask me to leave?" Just then he heard someone grumble. "Stop playing dumb. There are already more than 30 of us. What progress can we make if you're cultivating here too?" The man was instantly hushed by the rest of the group, but Shulian immediately understood. So that was it. A blessed land's spiritual energy was limited. If someone took half when cultivating, then anyone who came afterward would have to share the other half. If someone took 80% of it, then only the remaining 20 could be parceled out, and a person with a greater ability to absorb spiritual energy would leave even less for those others to use. The heavenly officials were afraid that Shulian would absorb most of the spiritual energy if he was there to cultivate. Anything that remained would have to be shared among the 30 of them, barely a sliver for each. Realizing this, the blood boiling in Shulian's head began to roil even more aggressively. He clenched his fists and stated coldly, "I will cultivate here." Another heavenly official spoke up. "Your Highness, we're only calling you Your Highness out of respect. You're nothing more than a mortal right now. Why must you fight with us over this spiritual land?" "Since I'm a mortal, and you're all heavenly officials, then what are you afraid of if I'm here to train?" Shulian said. "If I don't leave, are you going to chase me away by force?" Of course they couldn't do any such thing. Heavenly officials were not allowed to attack a mortal who hadn't committed any major sins, lest they be punished. These heavenly officials couldn't do anything to him. However, Shulian had forgotten one thing. As he stubbornly faced those 30-something heavenly officials, a voice broke in to say, "Seems your Highness has grown more of a backbone after being banished to the mortal realm. Not only will you rob mortals, you'll even offend heavenly officials. Ha ha!" It felt like Shulian had suddenly plunged into an icy cellar. He whipped his head up and saw that the one who had spoken was an unremarkable lower-ranking official, but not one who had been among the group that had caught him red-handed during the robbery incident. As Shulian had suspected, they had already gossiped about it. It hadn't all been in Shulian's head. Everyone really had been staring at him with judgment in their gazes. Everyone knew. All of these heavenly officials, they all knew. In an instant, Shulian felt like all of his bones had been pulled out. The fire burning in his veins was extinguished, and his eyes turned red. He stiffly looked at the junior officials who had seen him that night. "You said you wouldn't tell anyone," he rasped. Perhaps his burning stare pierced them too deeply, but the junior officials pinned under his gaze quickly waved their hands. "We didn't tell any outsiders." His eyes burning red, Shulian demanded, "Then how did they know?" None of the 30-some heavenly officials looked surprised when they heard his question. If so many of these heavenly officials already knew, how much of the upper court had been told? His question stumped the officials for a moment, but they quickly argued back. "Well, it's not like they're outsiders. We're all close friends here, with no secrets between us, so this doesn't count as telling. But we won't say anything to anyone besides the officials here." Shulian didn't wait for him to finish before he cried out sharply, "Lies! What a bunch of lies! I don't believe you!" The junior officials were starting to feel a little embarrassed at being cut off so pointedly, and they shrank back into the crowd. Just then one of the heavenly officials spoke up, his voice booming. "What does it matter if you believe them or not? You're already lucky that no one has exposed all the fine deeds your Highness has done here in the mortal realm, and you still ask them to keep a secret for you? Why are we obliged to keep your secrets? What a joke!" It was like a bucket of ice-cold water had been thrown in Shulian's face, followed by a blade piercing his heart. "No, Another heavenly official piped up. "You wouldn't fear mere talk if you hadn't done anything immoral. You're the one who's gone corrupt, and you blame others for not keeping their word. Keeping such unjust affairs under wraps would be the real crime." "No," Shulian cried. He wanted to say that he had his reasons, that he hadn't wanted to do it, but deep down he also knew that his reasons weren't important. All that mattered was that he did indeed try to rob someone. A stain like this was like a brand of shame on his face, and it made him feel infinitely small before these heavenly officials, too afraid to even raise his voice to defend himself. Seeing that his will was fading, one of the martial gods stepped forward. "Your Highness, now do you understand why we don't want you here to cultivate with us?" Shilian lowered his head and tightened his fists. The martial heavenly official continued. "We are not walking the same path, and travelers of different paths shall not meet. You should leave." The way he said that so presumptuously, understanding suddenly dawned on Shilian. At the end of the day, they were throwing around all these insults and accusations solely to make him give up this spiritual land. His fists clenched so hard that his knuckles cracked, and a lump weighed heavy in his throat for a while, before Shilian said darkly, "I'm not leaving. I will stay here and train." Right now his anger towards the 30-some heavenly officials had surpassed his embarrassment. Now that things had gone this far, what did he have left to lose? He might as well go all out. Instead of running away with his tail between his legs, he'd rather stand his ground, thick-skinned and immune to their barbs, and keep them from getting their way. Shilian's head snapped up. "I will train here," he repeated. "This mountain does not belong to any of you, so none of you have any right to ask me to leave." Now that he'd hardened his attitude, the 30-some heavenly officials' faces darkened. Shilian heard them muttering amongst themselves. "Why does he even bother? I've never seen anyone so shameless." They could gripe all they wanted, but Shilian would stay where he was. Even if his heart was bleeding profusely from being stabbed by spears of lips and swords of tongues, he would stubbornly refuse to move an inch. The martial heavenly official said, "It seems your Highness is bent on having his own way and making everyone else unhappy in the process." "Kick me out if you've got what it takes. Even if you want to, none of you have the skill," Shilian said coldly. At that, many of the heavenly officials' faces dropped, and they pulled out their weapons. Of course they would. Shilian's word had been a grave provocation to any martial god, and many of those present were just that. There was no way they could pretend that they hadn't heard. Shilian was quickly surrounded, but he wasn't scared at all. He had no blade in his hand except for the branch that he had been using as a walking stick. One of the martial gods had said severely, "Your Highness, if you apologize immediately, we will pretend that you didn't offend us." "If I've made anyone unhappy, I'm not sorry," Shilian replied. He pointed forward with the branch in his grip. "Because none of you are fit to be gods." A wave of outrage broke around Shilian. Someone snorted. "We're not fit? And someone who robs mortals is worthy?" Shilian couldn't hold back anymore, and he didn't want to either. He swept the branch through the air and charged at them, yelling, "You bullies!" The martial gods readied their weapons to welcome his attack, and the other heavenly officials standing in the back cried out to Shilian, "It's not like we forced you to rob people. Why are you blaming us?" But they were too happy too soon. They'd assumed that Shilian would be easy to take down, considering he had no spiritual powers or weapons. Yet unexpectedly, even though Shilian wielded only an ordinary branch, it was no different from a vicious blade in his hands. His strikes were incredibly strong, and forced his opponents back. Only a few moments had passed, and many of the martial gods' swords were nearly sent flying. They were scared of being sliced by the sharp winds the branches' swings stirred up. Every single one of Shilian's opponents fled to hide at the back of the group. These esteemed heavenly officials couldn't even defeat a banished mortal. What an embarrassment! Just then, one of the heavenly officials, watching this fight from a distance, shrieked, "What is this?" His cry alarmed the other heavenly officials. "What's going on?" The screaming heavenly official seemed to be in excruciating pain, doubled over and covering his face. "A ball of ghost fire just hit me in the eye! Did he do this somehow?" This was the official who had pointed at him and declared him a thief. Shilian snorted. "Ghost fire? If you want to steal this spiritual land, at least be frank about it. There's no need to slander me any further." His fury flared again, and his attacks grew more brutal. Every single spear and blade wielded by that circle of martial gods was knocked away by Shilian's entirely normal branch, and the weapons clattered as they scattered across the ground. At that moment someone yelled, We caught it! We caught it! Look! Shilian paused and steadied himself. The heavenly officials were in a tizzy. One of them was gripping something in their hand and raised it high for all to see. There really is a ghost fire. He's playing dirty. We've got proof. Shilian looked closely, and sure enough, it was a little ball of haunting, blazing ghost fire. I don't even know what's going on. How dare you accuse me of playing dirty just because you caught some ghost fire? Shilian cried out angrily. It's not like ghost fires are rare. Do you see my name written on it? The heavenly officials who had shrieked was clutching his eye. Why would a normal ghost fire attack my eyes? If it isn't under your control, why would it act like this? And I say it's some wandering spirit from the mountains that was frightened by you lot and came crashing in here by accident in a daze. Your proof is nonsense, Shilian rebuked. The martial god who had first attacked grabbed the ghost fire. Who cares whose control it's under? Just disperse a harmful thing like this, he said as he gripped it harder, looking like he planned to snuff out the spirit's fire. Seeing this, Shilian blurted, Let it go! He couldn't bear to have wandering spirits be dragged into their quarrel. He rushed to fight the martial god and retrieved the ghost fire. Since Shilian intended to rescue the spirit, he had to hold back a bit, and the two were soon at a standstill. Suddenly, a few heavenly officials called out from behind them. You're here? Come quick! Come see for yourself what's going on. Sounded like someone had arrived. You're finally here, another heavenly official cried. We've been waiting for you. Come give us a hand. Shilian was startled. Has someone powerful arrived? He thought. Who cares who it is? If they're going to give me trouble, I'll just go another round. I'm not afraid of anyone. He was brimming with resentment and ready for a huge brawl. But when the crowd parted, and the fashionably late arrival stepped forward, Shilian was absolutely stunned. The newcomer was Mu Ching. Hold on, let me drink.
No way. No way. Mu Ching. What do you mean?
Mu Ching obviously wasn't expecting to see Shilian like this either. The moment they came face to face, they were both dumbfounded. Shilian's eyes went wide, and he completely forgot about the martial gods he had been fighting. Why are you here? Aren't you? He muttered. But after only a few words, he noticed something and fell silent. He understood what had happened. Right now, Mu Ching wasn't wearing his old, worn black robes from when he'd been with them on the run. Rather, he was wearing a uniform befitting a martial heavenly official of the lower court. Function and Mu Ching had once been Shilian's left and right hands. Their abilities were highly praised and caught the eyes of many. When Shilian was banished, some heavenly officials had thought it a shame that Function and Mu Ching were banished with him. Some had even approached them in secret to ask whether they were willing to transfer their loyalties and serve another palace. It was feasible that a heavenly official had pulled Mu Ching up to the lower court as a gesture of recognition and had him work in their service. That had to be it. And he was clearly doing well for himself, as he was tagging along with this group of heavenly officials to search for blessed lands in which to cultivate. Shilian was still in a mortal body, but Mu Ching had already returned to the lower court. It was strangely ironic. With great effort, Mu Ching finally composed himself and asked in confusion, What's going on here? The heavenly officials all fought to tell their tales. Shilian stood at a distance, his body rigid. He noticed that they weren't telling Mu Ching about his robbery. What did that mean? It meant Mu Ching had already heard about the incident. Mu Ching knew he'd tried to rob someone. Drop after drop of cold sweat rolled down the side of Shilian's face, and he backed up a few steps involuntarily. The martial god who had been facing him earlier huffed in anger. He wants to take this spiritual land all for himself and chase us out. Mu Ching, hurry and help us. Help? He wanted Mu Ching's help in the fight against Shilian? Shilian was tingling with rage, shocked to the core. He finally snapped back to himself and stammered furiously. You? All of you are lying about what happened. So shameless. It wasn't like that at all. I clearly wasn't doing all that. Mu Ching was still just watching from the side, and was making Shilian anxious with rage. He charged forward with his branch again. The martial gods were having trouble defending against his attacks, and could only retreat in defeat. "Mu-Ching, why are you just standing there?" they yelled again. The other heavenly officials joined in on the hollering, but Mu-Ching still looked hesitant, like he didn't know whether he should attack. Julian heard them urge Mu-Ching to confront him directly, and wild fury blazed inside of him. "Mu-Ching isn't like you. He's my friend. He would never help you." He raged and struck even harder. Another row of weapons was sent flying. The rest of the heavenly officials saw that he was growing bolder the longer he fought, that things weren't going the way they should have. "Mu-Ching," they cried urgently, "are you just going to watch him make a mess of things like this?" Mu-Ching's expression changed erratically. He took a step forward, fingers twitching. "Don't just stand over there! Give us a hand!" a heavenly official called near him. It just had to be that moment when someone commented sarcastically, "It's understandable that Mu-Ching doesn't want to move. He was His Highness's personal attendant back in the day, after all. Even if His Highness robs mortals and steals our spiritual land, he can't help but be affected by the sentiments of their past relationship. It's enough that he hasn't teamed up with His Highness. How can we possibly expect more than that?" On the surface, the words sounded like they were giving Mu-Ching an excuse to stay out of things, but the comment was insidious. Veins crawled across Mu-Ching's forehead. The air was growing delicate, and Julian could only tell this was about to go wrong. "Mu-Ching." All he said was Mu-Ching's name, but a moment later, Julian's hands felt light. Then he heard a slashing sound. Julian blinked, and looked down to find that his only weapon, the tree branch, had been sliced in half. When he looked up again, Mu-Ching was holding a long saber, and the sharp tip was pointed directly at Julian. "Please leave," said Mu-Ching, weapon in hand. Julian stared at Mu-Ching in silence for a long time, gripping the broken branch. Finally, he said, I didn't want to rob anyone. And I wasn't trying to take over this spiritual land either. I got here first." Mu-Ching didn't comment. Instead, he repeated blankly, "Please leave." Julian gazed at him. After a moment of hesitation, he asked tentatively, "You know I'm not lying, right?" He was a little hopeful when he posed the question, but also a little scared. A voice in his head was telling him, "Stop asking, just turn around and walk away." Still, he couldn't help himself. Before Mu-Ching could respond, Julian slumped forward and fell heavily to the ground. The muddy mountain path was riddled with holes and ditches, covered in rocks and fallen leaves. Julian lay sprawled face down on the ground in the state of disbelief, his eyes bulging. One of the heavenly officials had shoved him while he was standing there at a loss, and made him take that hideous fall in front of so many eyes. It was too humiliating. There were voices all around Julian, high and low, filling the air and invading Julian's ears. He stared with eyes that couldn't be wider at the blackened ground in front of his nose. Then he slowly raised his head. Mu-Ching was standing not too far away from him. Standing among those heavenly officials, his head turned away, not looking at Julian. Just like the rest of them, he had no intention of lending Julian a hand to help him up. And thus Julian understood. No one would lend him a hand to help him up. He lay there prone for a long time before crawling up on his own. The heavenly officials thought he was about to kick off another bout and were exceedingly wary, but Julian wasn't looking for a fight anymore. He fumbled around, head bowed, and once he found the little satchel the queen had packed for him, he picked it up silently and secured it to his back. Then he turned around and headed down the mountain step by step. As he went, his steps grew faster and faster. It wasn't long before it turned into a mad dash. Julian held his breath and ran all the way down the mountain without resting for a moment. He didn't know how far he'd gone, and he didn't mind his footing, causing him to trip and fall once more. The breath he'd been holding was finally released, accompanied by a mouthful of angry blood. Flustered, he didn't even think to get back up, just sat on the ground panting. Once his breathing slowly returned to normal, he still didn't think to stand up. He remained there in a befuddled daze. Suddenly, a hand was extended to him. Julian blinked slowly at it, and his eyes followed the arm up. It was Mu-Ching again. He was standing next to Shilian with his hand outstretched, looking a little ashen. A long moment later, he asked stiffly, "Are you all right?" Shilian stared at him with empty eyes and didn't speak. Mooching averted his gaze. Perhaps the chilling stare was making him uncomfortable. Nonetheless, he kept his hand outstretched. "Come on." But he had reached out, too late. Shilian didn't take his hand, and he didn't get up either. He just kept staring at him with unblinking eyes. The two remained at a standstill for a long time, and Mooching looked more and more upset. Just as he was about to pull his hand back, Shilian grabbed a handful of mud and flung it at Mooching. It hit him with a loud splat. Mooching had never expected him to do something like that, and he still didn't know whether to call it rude or juvenile. Filthy mud splattered on his chest, and spots scattered onto his bewildered face. Anger rolled up a moment later, but he forced it down. "I didn't have a choice," he said in a low voice. He truly didn't. He had been getting along so well with all those heavenly officials, and they might have thought he was on Shilian's side if he just stood idly and watched his colleagues get pulverized. And that would have made his life so much more difficult. It was as if Shilian had forgotten how to speak, and could do nothing but hurl mud at him. Mooching blocked a couple of shots, but couldn't keep up with his pace. "Have you gone crazy? Didn't I just tell you that I didn't have a choice?" he cried furiously. "Didn't you rob someone because you also didn't have a choice?" "Scram! Get out of here! Leave!" Those were the only words echoing in Shilian's mind, but he couldn't utter a single sound, could only crazily grab at anything nearby he could throw. He didn't care who he hurled things at either. Finally, Mooching couldn't take it any more. With a gloomy expression, he left with a sweep of his sleeves. Shilian panted harshly for a bit, and fell back down, spacing out once more. He sat in that position until nightfall. Once the skies turned dark, a crowd of phosphorescent flames approached and floated around him, dancing hauntingly about. It was like Shilian didn't see them. He didn't bother mustering the strength to look. As if the phosphorescent flames were annoyed that they hadn't been noticed, more and more gathered around Shilian. He still ignored them. That is, until a humanoid figure emerged from the assembly of flames. The arrival of this man was always accompanied by a feeling of immense foreboding. When he sensed that ominous feeling, Shilian slowly lifted his head. A white-clothed man was standing about 10 paces away amidst the countless floating phosphorescent flames. Half of the mask on his face smiled eerily. "How are you, Your Highness?" he greeted pleasantly. That's the end of chapter 98. Alright, so...
I'm gonna kill myself.
Yeah. 1. Do you remember season 1? They went into Hua Cheng's backstory, and he amassed power by challenging 35 heavenly officials to duels and defeating and stealing all the shrines of 33 of them. And the 2 others were Mooching and Fengshen. So those 33 are those guys.
Jesus.
It's so good. So good. And then Mooching and Fengshen didn't accept it.
Bro.
Yeah. He reached out too late. Kills me.
Dude.
And then fuckface over here shows up at the end like, "Hi."
Fuckface. Oh.
Yeah, we're almost there. Chapter 99 is next.
That was the long one.
Huh? It's kind of long. It's kind of long, and then 100 is long, but that's the one. This is where it peaks.
Okay.
You want to play toys?